Our gospel reading for today is in Matthew chapter 9, beginning in verse 9. As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." While he was saying this, a synagogue leader came and knelt before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and put your hand on her, and she will live." Jesus got up and went with him, and so did his disciples. Just then, a woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak. She said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be healed." Jesus turned and saw her. "Take heart, daughter," he said, "your faith has healed you." And the woman was healed at that moment. When Jesus entered the synagogue leader's house and saw the noisy crowd and the people playing pipes, he said, "Go away, the girl is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took the girl by the hand, and she got up. News of this spread throughout all that region. The word of the Lord. Amen. You may be seated. So I've titled today's sermon, "The Doctor is In." A couple of years ago, I started having some pretty intense pain, kind of like in my lower abdomen. And it was nothing I couldn't manage. I told myself I was fine. It was probably just something I ate working its way through, and it'll pass. But of course, it didn't pass. Like a week went by, and another week, and the pain wasn't going anywhere. If anything, it was getting worse and worse. It was getting more and more painful. Even simple movements of picking something up or holding my guitar or walking upstairs or something would just give me excruciating pain. But of course, as any responsible adult, I had things to do, right? I had yard work and household chores to do. I had kids' school and band events to attend. I had worship to lead and sermons to preach and small groups to oversee, and I was fine. I just needed to push through. Until finally, Angela one day just kind of talked some sense into me and said, "Rodger, you are in too much pain. Something is obviously really wrong. Go to the doctor. Go to the doctor." And I'll pick up that story in a little bit, but here's the thing for this morning. This morning, Jesus has something to say to all of us who are just really good at toughing it out. We're really good at telling ourselves, "Oh, I'm fine." We're good at comparing ourselves to other people. "Well, I don't have it as bad as so-and-so. They're in a much worse position than I am. I'm okay." For people like us who we're really good at waiting just a little bit too long to ask for help. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, Jesus said, but the sick. And the good news, and when I say the good news, I mean this is the good news. This is the gospel of the kingdom that Jesus came to preach. The good news is that Jesus is the great physician who heals the disease of sin. He is the great physician who heals the disease of sin. Now, you may or may not be aware, but this name that we've attributed to Jesus, the great physician, raise your hand. Have you heard of this before? The great physician. It oftentimes it'll creep up in our prayers if we're praying for healing for someone or something. It's not in the Bible. Okay? That doesn't mean don't use it, but it's not in the Bible, but it comes from one of our great hymns. It's not in our hymn book. I realized this week. I went to look it up. It is not in our hymn book. But it comes from one of our great hymns, which is inspired by today's gospel reading. The hymn is called "The Great Physician is Now Near." And the first verse of it reads, "The great physician is now near, the sympathizing Jesus. He speaks the drooping heart to cheer. Oh, hear the voice of Jesus." And then the refrain that will be repeated throughout the hymn, "Sweetly the echo of his tone, softly and tenderly, Jesus of Nazareth passes by." I love this. Softly and tenderly, Jesus of Nazareth passes by. And I want to just kind of point out three things as Jesus passes by that we see in this passage this morning. First, interestingly, this is the picture that Jesus paints, is that sin is a disease to be healed. There's a number of metaphors in the Bible that the Bible uses to talk about sin. We attribute different language to it. We try to use different pictures in our mind to help us understand what is sin, what is the problem, and then how do you deal with it. Sometimes it's pictured in terms of lawlessness, that there's this like willful, active rebellion against God or a disregard for his law, and therefore there's either punishment or pardon that's needed because of this infraction that was done. Sometimes the Bible talks about sin as, we use the word trespass. Even in our version of the Lord's Prayer that we pray, we use this word, "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." A trespass or a misstep, as it sometimes is translated. The picture here is of a traveler who is walking down a path and then suddenly like stumbles or slips a little bit off of the path. And the remedy for this then is, did you get back on the path, right? Sometimes the Bible talks about sin as debt. Again, sometimes in the Lord's Prayer we pray, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." It's another beautiful way to translate it. In this debt metaphor, sin is framed in like sort of a transactional manner. It's something is owed to someone else that must be paid. And until that thing is paid, then we're not cool with each other. We're not in right relationship. And that debt must be paid if there's going to be some kind of restoration or whatever. And there's a number of other ones, but one of the most common one, the Greek word is actually harmatia, and it means missing the mark. This image is of missing the mark, meaning like the failure to hit a target, like with an arrow, or these days with a gun, right? You're aiming at something, but you're not quite there. And the picture, in terms of sin, is of a life that is just off-center from God's good design. God's good intentions for us, the best that he created us for in Eden, our life has gone askew. And this is the word that's used in this passage here, that even Jesus uses when he says, "I've come to call sinners." I've come to call these people who their life is off-center from God's best for them. Jesus here, he does not talk at all about sin as like guilt that is to be punished because you broke a law, you rebellious, horrible person. He doesn't talk about sin as a debt to be forgiven. Oh, well, you now owe, so you better pay up. He doesn't talk about it in those terms. He talks about sin as a disease to be healed. A disease to be healed. Something that's just inherently wrong from the inside out, that is going to have disastrous, even deadly effects. And so here the prescription is different. It's not, you either have to be punished or pardoned. It's not, well, you or somebody else better pay off this debt. The prescription is just being with Jesus. Being in the presence of the great physician. Which brings me to my second point, is that what Jesus does then is Jesus invites in those who know they are sick. He's come to call those people who know they're sick. He came to call them in order to heal them, in order to restore them to right relationship with themselves and God and the world, to ultimately commission them to go out into the world. He came to call those who know they're sinners, not those who are convinced of their righteousness, who are already convinced of, well, I've got my act together. Not those who have convinced themselves and talked themselves into believing that they're healthy, like I was doing for myself. I'm fine. I'm good. I can handle it. It's no big deal. Just keep on. He came to call those who are humble enough to admit that they're not well. And somehow, in this passage, what's amazing to me is that somehow this disease of sin is healed by simply being with Jesus, by just being near to him, by accepting his invitation, by engaging in conversation with him. In a moment, we'll get to some of the other healing stories that Matthew tells immediately following this passage. But first, we see people being healed of this disease of sin just by eating at the table with him. Just sharing dinner with Jesus. These tax collectors, right? These people who were Jews, but they were betrayers of their own people by colluding with Rome in the oppression of their own people. These tax collectors were welcomed at the table with Jesus. Imagine what that would be like. Imagine how that trajectory and aim of your life would start shifting just by sharing dinner with this man. They use this broad term, sinners, right? Of all varieties and sorts, were welcomed into the presence of the Holy One. Imagine being one of these who was labeled by everyone else in the community, especially the religious elite, as being sinners. You've missed all the marks. Your life is totally off trajectory. But now here you are eating with Jesus, and your arrow starts recalibrating. You feel it start centering in on the good life that God does want for you. You know, back to my story. Angela told me to go to the doctor, and so I finally went to the doctor. What changed was just being in the presence of the doctor. Just showing up was all I really needed to do. Just being there. The doctor examined me. All he really needed to do was put some firm pressure on one particular part, and I raised my voice, and he's like, I know what's going on. He gave me a name for my condition. It's a little thing called diverticulitis. Not fun. It's an infection of the lining of the colon. That's all you need to know. Super painful. And I have to tell you, hearing that word produced this complex mix of feelings in me. First, there was relief because there's a name for it. There's a name for it. I know what I'm dealing with. Great. Now we can handle it. But there was also fear because the more he told me about diverticulitis, the more I understood how serious and complicated it could become if left untreated. And isn't this true of sin? If we can't name it, if we can't allow the good physician to name it, the complications become deadly. So I took the doctor's recommendation of rest, some temporary dietary restrictions, and some antibiotics, and pretty soon I was well. And this is what Matthew intentionally structures this passage in this chapter to illustrate for us, what he wants to show us. Jesus says, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And then what does Matthew immediately show us? 3 people being healed. Matthew's doing this intentionally. He does this all throughout his gospel, by the way. He will tell us something about Jesus, and then he'll show us. But he actually shows 3 people being healed. First, Jesus is approached by a broken-hearted father just begging for help. We need to count this in the healings that happened. Second, Jesus steps into the room with that father's dead daughter. We don't know what happened. We don't know if it was an illness. We don't know if it was a disease, or an accident. But whatever happened, this was the end result of what sin ultimately does to human beings. It kills them. Third, in the middle of the story, trying to get to that man's house, a woman with a bleeding condition, which had kept her socially isolated from people for 12 years. She would not have been allowed to touch people or them to touch her. She wouldn't have been getting dinner invitations from family or friends. Imagine being socially distanced from everyone for over a decade. She sneaks up and touches Jesus' cloak. And of course, we see the results of what happens when these people approach the doctor. The woman with the bleeding condition is immediately healed. And again, this meant not only that she was relieved of her physical suffering, but she would now be able to have full relationships with other people. Friends and family who she hadn't been able to hug in over a decade. Invitations that she wasn't able to accept from neighbors for dinner. To be able to go and worship in the temple. She was kept from all of these things, and now she was able to have full relationship with them rather than being kept at arm's length because she was unclean. This little girl who had died, again, from some unknown disease or accident, was raised from the dead, brought back to life. All these people were laughing at Jesus the same way we would have because we know there's a difference between being dead and being asleep. But he healed her. It just says he took her by the hand. So close. This account, he doesn't even use words. He just takes her by the hand. This presence of Jesus just heals. And then the broken heart of this father who lost his precious daughter, his heart is healed. The worst pain that any parent can go through was now replaced with joy and love and celebration. So let's not forget this big picture that Matthew is trying to paint for us here. Because he's not just talking about physical healing. As he tells these stories, he's not just talking about physical healing, the physical results of sin and death, as in the woman's bleeding condition or the little girl dying. That's part of it. And he's not just talking about the emotional and relational healing, as in the woman being fully accepted into society again, or the father being able to hug and then continue to raise his daughter again. This is true as well. There's also that emotional and relational healing. But Matthew is what he's getting at here is the root problem of all of these things, which is spiritual healing from sin itself. The root cause, the root disease from which all these other sufferings emanate. And we sometimes use words like forgiveness or sanctification. But Matthew's picture that he gives us is this. Is that what Jesus does with bodies, he wants to do with lives. What Jesus does in these individuals' bodies, he wants to do with every person's entire life. He wants to heal. He wants to restore. There's this phrase that I love that I learned from a vineyard pastor that I got to do a little bit of ministry with. And he was particularly gifted in just praying for healing for people. And we should know this, as a Methodist church, we fully believe that God heals today. And we're going to have some opportunity if you want some prayer for that this morning as well. But we fully believe that God heals today. But what would happen is he would go out, he would pray for someone, and if they were healed, right? If pain in the leg was gone, or if their hearing or hard of hearing and their ears were opened up, whatever it was, he would look at them and they're awestruck that this pain is gone or that they can hear again or whatever. And he would say, what God just did to your leg, he wants to do to your entire life. What God just did to your ears, he wants to do to your whole life. And he would welcome them into the kingdom of Jesus in that moment. What Jesus does with bodies, he does with entire lives. These pictures that Matthew gives us here, again, strategically after this part where Jesus is saying, I've come to call sinners, not those who are righteous. It's the sick who need a doctor, not those who think they're so healthy. Matthew shows us these healing stories to illustrate how Jesus comes as the great physician. What Jesus did in these people's bodies, he wants to do in the life of everyone who recognizes their sin is a disease that requires his healing presence, his healing touch. All those tax collectors and sinners gathered at Matthew's house, the woman suffering from the bleeding condition, the crowd mourning at the home of the synagogue leader, what Jesus did in those people's bodies, he wants to do for all of them. What Jesus did in these people's bodies, he wants to do for your whole life. What Jesus did in those people's bodies, he wants to do in my whole life. What Jesus did in those people's bodies, he wants to do in the life of every single person who lives around you or that you encounter. Everyone. And so the question for us here this morning is this, is like, where are you still sick? Where are you still sick? Because we're all in process. We are all in constant need of healing. We're all in constant need of rooting out sin in our life. We need to constantly draw back to Jesus to mitigate those effects of sin that it wants to have on us. Where are you still sick? Where do you need to come to Jesus today? And it might be physical, it might be emotional, it might be relational, it might be in any area of your life. But where is the disease of sin causing you to suffer? Draw near to Jesus with that. And in this, I think there's some really powerful implications for us as a church in this regard. And this is perhaps like a whole other sermon, so I will keep it short. But I couldn't stop thinking about this week, is that if Jesus is a doctor, then his church is meant to be a hospital. Let me make this more personal. If Jesus is a doctor, then Burns is meant to be a hospital. And do we think of it that way? For ourselves, but more so, I think, for other people. What if we as Burns were to become a hospital for our community, where people are drawn in and welcomed in to be healed by Jesus? How might we be good friends and good neighbors who encourage people to get the help and care that they need, who help them to see their condition and with compassion, not with shame on them, but who help them get over whatever their objections to Jesus might be? We just encourage them. We invite them to come. And it takes humility, but humble themselves to come and ask for help rather than just tough it out. People all around us are doing that with their whole lives. Their whole lives that are suffering and broken. They're just trying to press through. What if we're sort of like the ambulance drivers who help the most dire cases get here? Help them get to Jesus as quickly as possible. We go out to them. We're not waiting for them to show up at our door, but we're going out and we're saying, come on, what if we literally give someone a ride? What if that's all we need to do? The ambulance drivers aren't the doctors. What if we're just ambulance drivers sometimes? What if we were the nurses who help care for people as they heal, as they recover, as they rebuild their lives here in Jesus? I just want to suggest that if we are not here to be a hospital for our community, then why are we here? We're not here to just do religious things. We're not here to go through the motions of reading our scriptures and singing our songs and nodding at our sermons and saying, thanks, Rodger, that was a good word today, and then just going about living our lives. If Jesus is a doctor, then maybe our church is meant to be a hospital. And I want to close just by reminding us, like, how does his healing come to those soul-sick sinners? By dining with them around the table. Somehow just sitting in the presence of Jesus around the table heals the disease of sin within us. And this is why we come to his table every Sunday. This is why Jesus said, every time that you do this, remember me. It's why John Wesley said, as often as you can partake of Holy Communion, do it. Because it is around this table that we receive grace and are healed by the great physician.